this land ownership business is kind of interesting in that we have on our ranch a checkerboarded state land set up. And that began as, I guess, federal land, which was given to the Northern Pacific Railway that said, yuck, we don't like the trees and the iron's pretty thin in that Jurassic soil. So they borrowed money. Pretty soon the land was owned by foreclosure by an insurance company. They set out the leased land that all of the people preceding us had used for nothing. They tried to lease the land. Why should they lease the land? It wasn't worth fencing. They just continued to graze it, okay? And so eventually the insurance company quit paying taxes and the state took over the land in lieu of unpaid taxes. There's some talk about that over here. So I'm trying to say that land ownership, and I'm going to talk about a type of ownership that the Devil's Kitchen Management Group dealt with, which has nothing to do with legalities, but has to do with civility and how you get along with your neighbors. Before that, I can't resist a little tale about global warming. Everyone has one, but as you know, pine bark beetle is raising hell with the forest around here, which is, of course, the best thing that ever happened to grazing. It's the best thing that ever happened to the fisheries. It's the best thing that's happened in 50 years in Montana, okay? Clayton Marlowe here, a range manager at Montana State University, says that the expanded forests of the last 40 years were consuming more groundwater than all irrigation that takes place in the state of Montana. So we can expect to be blessed by this. Now, furthermore, I bring the story up because it provides an answer to the issue of what do we do about these people who build their homes in combustible forests. The fact is, what you do is you sneak in there at night, drop off infected logs, kill their trees. It's no longer desirable, okay? Secondly, these trees are fireproof once they've lost their needles. I can demonstrate that. There was a big fire came through the Beartooth Game Range west of us in around 1990. It was a crown fire, burned all the needles off, okay? In 2007, 17 years later, the place reburned and not one of those dead trees got fire. Okay, they're absolutely fireproof. Okay, so let's go. Okay, the Devil's Kitchen Management Group has the honor of being the most effective management group in the state of Montana, perhaps worldwide. That's easily claimed because we're the only such management group that I know of in the world. We have no charter, we have no definite membership, we have no officers, we have no dues, we have no budget, and we have no authority by anybody to do anything, okay? But we are, in fact, presumably controlling the world. Before I get to that, I want to talk about this alternative to legal ownership. The properties that we're presumably managing, in the sense of giving advice on, is about 1/3 of a million acres that lie south and east of Cascade, Montana, and it's foothills country connecting the big belts with the little belts. It's marvelously productive, but the management is interesting because we are surrounded by a game range, used to be a winter game range, now it's a wildlife management area, a wilderness area, Forest Service to the south and west. We have checkerboarded BLM lands, we have checkerboarded state lands, we have isolated pieces of BLM land, and we have some very, very productive livestock grazing habitat. It turns out that it's not only very nice for raising cattle and historically sheep there, but it's marvelously productive of some organisms that have no respect whatsoever for property lines. But one of these, of course, is weather. We can't do anything about the weather, so but it does affect how our management accomplishes its goals. This winter's been a tough one, and the autumn was. I'll tell you more about that in a minute too. So anyway, it's interesting that some sportsmen's groups had, in fact, claimed ownership of campgrounds when it was hunting season in the Beartooth Game Range. And they had $10,000 tent cities that they moved in. It was like the Oklahoma land rush when they were permitted to come in and set up the camp, and they just excluded the ordinary guy who had his pup tent or whatever. And it was, we found that if we were going to manage the elk eventually, which was the whole story, we were going to have to deal with this concept of ownership one way or another. It was greatly facilitated by the fact that the fire came through, burned all their camps down. They no longer had $10,000 or $20,000 invested in this, so they were much more amenable to discussion after that. We didn't set the fire, okay? There are also kind of an ownership it's something like, squatters' rights, I guess, or historical use or something like that. And before it was all said and done, we were accused by people in the town of Cascade of being too damn democratic, okay? That is, when we tried to be fair, it excluded them who felt they had an ownership interest in our part of the world. Now, how productive is this place? We all know how wonderful Yellowstone Park is. If you take the the carrying capacity that's been maintained for years and years and years in our part of the world, and you extrapolate the Yellowstone Park, and you say a cow unit is equivalent to a buffalo unit, you should have 120,000 buffalo grazing in Yellowstone Park. On top of that intensity of grazing from cattle, we have 2,500 elk. These are the equivalent of 1,500 unbranded cows that jump fences or go through fences, and your privilege of controlling them is limited to one hunting permit a year. I use that to try to describe to people in North and South Dakota at some meetings in Colorado what impact a herd of 2,500 elk can have on grazing operations. So it all got started roughly 20 years ago when Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, in its wisdom, decided that they were going to adjust the management goals for the Devil's Kitchen elk management area, which is much broader than just hunting districts. They were going to adjust it upwards, and they were going to manage for about 15 or 20% more elk than were already there, which was roughly 2,000. And I said, ooh, called up Chase Hibbard, my neighbor, and other neighbors, Lanes and so forth, and I said, did anybody ask you about this? And they said, well, we heard there was a hearing. So I'm going to we had conversations this morning about hearings and how people weren't permitted to speak. We decided, after some considerable discussion with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and others, that we were going to begin a discussion group which would be the antithesis of a hearing where everybody stands up and pontificates and you know exactly what they're going to say before they say it. We're going to throw the doors wide open. Everybody's going to be invited in. They're all going to have an opportunity to say what the hell's wrong with the world. And then they have to say what they think should be done about it. And so we did this for weeks, basically, 3 or 4 hours a day on 3 or 4 occasions, and we just tabulated everything. And it could be reduced down eventually to people want to shoot a bull elk, okay? That's the high value enterprise of the whole wildlife management of bull elk.